It's Mark Siomo. This is a Ways and Means hearing. I am the chair and the Allston Brighton District City Councilor. Today is Monday, October 15th, and we are here to review Docket 1441, message and order approving an appropriation of $105,400,000 from the Surplus Property Disposition Fund for the purpose of providing funding for the completion of the city's signature open spaces, the Emerald Necklace, and funding to the Boston Housing Authority to support redevelopment of communities at Old Colony in South Boston and Orient Heights in East Boston. I'd like to remind folks this is a public hearing being taped and broadcast on Comcast Channel 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. I'd ask folks in the chamber to silence their electronic devices. At the conclusion of the presentation and questions from my colleagues, we will take public testimony. There is a sign-in sheet to my left. I ask that you state your name, any affiliation, residence, and please mark the box yes if you do wish to testify and no if you don't. I'd also like to introduce my colleagues in order of their arrival. To my far left, Councilor at Large Michelle Wu. To my immediate left, District City Councilor Matt O'Malley. To my far left again, District City Councilors Ed Flynn and Frank Baker. Thanks for joining me. Justin, are you taking the first shot?
I will.
Great.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Councilor Siomo, Councilor Wu, Councilor Flynn, Councilor Baker, and Councilor O'Malley for inviting us here to testify today. My name is Justin Starrett. I'm the city's budget director. I'm here to offer testimony on the appropriation docket before you today. I'm also joined by my colleagues from Environment, Energy, and Open Space, Chief Chris Cook, Treasury Drew Smith, and from the BHA, Bill McGonigal. Docket 1441 covers a $105.4 million appropriation from the Surplus Property Fund to various vital capital projects throughout the city. This order is in addition to $1.6 million already appropriated by this council as part of the FY19 budget, bringing the total investment from the sale of the Winthrop Square Garage to $107 million. As you know, the mayor proposed dedicating the proceeds of the sale of the Winthrop Square Garage to specific projects that will have a tremendous positive impact on the city. Significant new capital funding will go towards investments in the city's signature open spaces, like $23 million in capital for Franklin Park, $23 million in capital for the Boston Common, and $11 million in capital towards completing the Emerald Necklace by greening Columbia Road. Funding will also go towards the city's goal of creating and preserving affordable housing through the BHA's redevelopment efforts at Old Colony and Orient Heights. This includes $25 million in capital for Old Colony and $10 million for Orient Heights. And finally, funding will be provided to endow 3 new $5 million trust funds to support enhanced maintenance at the Common, Franklin Park, and the Greenway. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on the specifics of the appropriations, but I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Cook, to walk you through some of the open space projects.
Councilors, thank you so much, and respectfully ask your approval on the appropriation of these funds. As you know, Boston Common is America's first park, and as it enters into 2018, and since 1634, it has served the neighborhood, but that neighborhood is densifying, and Boston Common has to perform at a higher level now than it ever has before. So we're excited this opportunity, not only for the capital investment, but also for a trust to make sure that we expand our maintenance opportunities in there. Boston Common is lovingly maintained in partnership with the Friends of the Public Garden. They do extraordinary work and contribute over $2.5 million on an annual basis to Boston Common, the Public Garden, and Commonwealth Avenue Mall. But these trusts will enable us to take better care of the Common and serve generations to come, as well as the capital reinvestment on such long underserved project as the Frog Pond and Deer Park Maintenance Yard, as well as the parade grounds. I also want to call your attention to the once-in-a-generational opportunity to invest in Boston's largest park, Franklin Park, bordered by Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, Dorchester, and other neighborhoods. Franklin Park is a major amenity, not only from a recreational standpoint, but also from an environmental justice and also an ecological impact. It's arguably our most important ecological habitat in the city of Boston. This represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to invest in it. And once again, in partnership with the Franklin Park Coalition, a trust will enable us to have enhanced maintenance over this park for future generations to come. I also want to call your attention to the concept of completing the Emerald Necklace and the idea that Columbia Road can become a livable street that has an ecological, a positive benefit for its neighborhoods, but also connects some of our most historically underserved neighborhoods, such as Bowdoin, Geneva, and Upham's Corner, with the vibrancy of a harbor community, and also Franklin Park. We want to envision a greenway that is responsible for making sure that our citizens have opportunities and make sure that it's relevant moving into 2018. We don't envision a system like the Riverway and the Jamaica Way, but what we envision is an Emerald Necklace for the next generation. And of course, last but not least, I want to cite the importance of one of our newest, but still a signature open space in our city, the Rose Kennedy Greenway, and the opportunity to enhance that greenway and make sure that it's cared for in perpetuity. Happy to answer any questions the council might have, but we're very, very excited about this opportunity in my cabinet. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And before I let you go again, let me introduce Councilor Josh Zakum has joined us as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Dear Chairman Siomo and members of the council, I have appeared before this body several times over the past few years detailing the funding decline that the Boston Housing Authority has experienced over the past decade due to cuts in financial support for public housing. The cumulative impact of this puts many of our properties at risk. Two of these properties are the A&M Lynch Homes at Old Colony in South Boston and the Orient Heights Public Housing Development in East Boston. With both of these sites, we have begun a process of comprehensive redevelopment through public-private partnerships to redevelop and preserve this deeply affordable housing for current and future residents of our city. In order to continue this work through the next phases, we are reliant on the city commitment that has been made possible through the sale of the Winthrop Street Garage. At the A&M Lynch Homes, we have been fortunate to receive two separate $22 million seed grants from the federal government through the Hope 6 program and through ARA stimulus funding. With these grants, we were able to complete about half of this 840-unit site. But there are no such federal grants on the horizon at this point, and we still have over 400 severely deteriorating units left to redevelop that are currently housing many families anxiously awaiting this transition. With $25 million from the Winthrop Square Garage, we will be able to complete replacement of the next 250 deeply affordable units at the site, leveraging millions in additional private and public investment to complete the next quadrant at Old Colony. At Orient Heights, we have similarly begun a redevelopment of this 331-unit site through a public-private partnership. We have already completed 120 new units with funding from the BHA and its partner DHCD. With the $10 million from Winthrop Garage, likewise, we will leverage millions of additional private and public funding to construct another 88 units at the site. Conditions at the site are challenging, and we recently had to close the building housing the management office and resident community space due to severe water penetration issues. Residents have been relocated from Phase 2 units, and we are prepared to go forward with demolition and redevelopment with these funds. As part of our testimony, we are presenting a letter of support from resident leaders for both the A&M Lynch Homes and Old Colony at Old Colony and Orient Heights. As I'm sure you all know, our residents deserve your support and deserve the investment that Mayor Walsh and the city have committed to them. We will make excellent use of these dollars to attract private sector partners and funding, and will continue to explore creative ways to generate redevelopment funds for our public housing. In closing, I respectfully request that you support the investment in our public housing communities in order to preserve these badly needed resources for Boston's poor and working families. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, councilors. I'm Drew Smith and serve as head of Treasury for the City of Boston. This is my first time in front of you in this role, I think in any role, and I appreciate you having me.
Welcome, Drew.
As Senior Deputy Treasurer, I oversee not only Treasury, but also the city's trust division, which is a part of Treasury. And in that role, I'd like to walk you quickly through the structure of these trusts if established. As mentioned, as a part of this appropriation, there would be 3 trusts established, each funded with an initial $5 million. 2 of the 3 funds are set up similarly with both the Boston Common Maintenance Trust and the Franklin Park Maintenance Trust, consisting of 3 member boards responsible for the actual spending decisions within the allowable bounds of the trust, which have been set in the document. Each board would consist of a mayoral appointment, a city councilor on an ex officio basis, and an appointment by the respective friends groups for each park. Funds would be made available similar to other trusts and would be on a reimbursable or a direct pay to the contractor basis. And these funds would be made available only from the income of the trusts that are generated. In the case of the Greenway, the collector-treasurer, rather than having a 3-member board, the collector-treasurer would serve as the sole trustee and make the distribution directly to the Greenway on a quarterly basis. Along with that, the Greenway would also have a quarterly reporting requirement. In all cases of these 3 trusts, but also all the trusts that the city has, the collector-treasurer will be responsible for the ongoing investment and care of the funds on a sole basis. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have with respect to the structure of the trust, but these generally look similar to the others that we have in the division.
Great, thank you. Do you have an estimate, Drew, of about how much income at, present market conditions these $5 million trusts will earn?
Sure. We generally assume that income spun off of trusts, regardless of the size, is about $5 million. Is about 5%. In the case of $5 million trust, that would be about $250,000 a year.
And again, I know the commissioner really sharpens his pencil every single year to do more with virtually less. So this is a great way to keep up with our signature parks. So I do support the establishment of these funds. Can you drill down a little more on the Conservancy Fund? Obviously, it's owned by DOT, managed by a private nonprofit. Could you kind of speak to those more unique issues on the Conservancy side?
Well, from the trust perspective, and I may give this to one of my colleagues, but from perspective of the trust, rather than having a 3-member board of 3 trustees that are actually making the spending decisions, in a sense, there are not necessarily spending decisions to be made. The collector-treasurer would serve as the trustee, which is the one that has authority to release the funds and invest the money. But the funds are actually made on a quarterly basis, and then we receive spending information after the fact from ongoing spending reporting requirements that they have to provide us as a part of an MOU associated with the trust. So it's difficult to drill down much more on the actual ways that the funds would be used without kind of passing it off to a colleague that might have a better idea.
I would just speak very briefly to the 2 city trusts, and the opportunity that we have there is that these are actual city properties that we actually own. And actually, in both cases, we co-manage both those spaces with these partner groups, whether it's the Coalition at Franklin Park or the Friends of the Public Garden at Boston Common, and so that those decisions will be made jointly by the member of the trust and also the district councilor.
Okay, so I guess my question should be, why are we setting up this particular trust for the Conservancy without the 3 trustees, one being a city councilor?
Well, the primary function of the trustees in any trust is just to govern the actual spending decisions and vet what those recommendations might be. In the case of the Conservancy, there's actually not a role in determining how it's going to be spent because that's already being done at the Conservancy level. Right. All we're doing is facilitating the transfer of the funds.
Right, and you said quarterly, Drew?
Quarterly.
So if it earns the 250, say 240 for the math, 60 per quarter. Right. And it's not a reimbursement. Did you say it was a reimbursement?
No, not in this case.
It's just a payout.
In the other 2, correct. Yeah, so the way we would do this is that we would know what their principal balance was as of February 1st of each year for the end of the last calendar year. Okay. We would then calculate 5% off that. So let's say it's $250,000, and we would make debt available starting July 1. But you're exactly right. In the case of this, we would actually divide that into 4 equal payments and just make those distributions on a quarterly basis.
Gotcha. Okay. Let me give my colleagues a chance to weigh in here. Councilor Michelle Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm interested in the timelines for some of the, are all of these, for example, the 3-member, the Boston Common Maintenance Trust Fund, the Franklin Park and Greenway, the ones that have the trustees, are those all set up and running, and when can they expect the first sort of real kickoff?
Well, the funds have been set up, so the kind of shell accounts have been set up to receive the money. So as soon as we are able to get those appointed and the funds are deposited, we'll be ready to go.
And this 105 million was the amount from closing? I can't remember all the details of how much and how much was dependent on achieving certain metrics.
Sure. So it was 102 million on closing, which happened a few weeks ago, and then we have a sort of stipulation in the contract that we get a certain percentage of condo sales up to another $60 million, and this would be essentially using some other surplus money that we have in the fund right now as an offset, because we truly believe that all of these projects laid out here are needed to get started right now, and I think thanks to this council, last year we were actually able to kick off the FY19 planning efforts for Franklin, the Common, and the Emerald Necklace.
And so how are the condo sales at this point?
So they won't have final figures. We have a sort of process in place by which they close, but that won't be for at least a year or two.
Okay. Okay. And then turning to the Housing Authority properties. So how much is the construction budget for, I guess, the entire renovations of each of the developments?
It's about $550,000 per unit. Do the math. I don't know the number right off the top of my head, Counselor, but that's the per
And you
unit.
said it was 840 units in South Boston and 331 in East
Well,
Boston?
the total number of units at Ann M. Lynch Homes at Old Colony is 840 units. We'll be doing around 220 in this next phase. Orient Heights, there are 331 total units. We'll be doing, and we've completed 120 out there already, and we'll be adding an additional 88 in this second phase.
Okay. And so in terms of the sources of funding for each of the phases, how much, the way that the state was participating was just through tax credits primarily?
Well,
or
tax credits, and at Orient Heights, I believe they contributed $15 million, $18 million, $15 million to the construction costs to match the mayor of the city's $10 million commitment.
Okay. And so that will take the BHA through the next 88 units. And then is there a plan for the remaining 130 or so?
Not a specific plan, although we continue to have conversations with DHCD as recently as a few weeks ago with Jay Ash, and as recently as last week with Crystal Cornegay. There's clearly a commitment from our state partners to finding a way to complete that housing development. And I have every confidence we will figure it out.
Okay. And at the Ann M. Lynch Homes, you said there's 220 in this next phase. And how many had been previously completed?
About half, so 420-ish, I think, have been completed.
Okay. And so this one-time payment will just be used for these next phases, and then that's
Yeah,
it
it gets us about 3/4 of the way finished, and the last phase, this will need some additional vetting with the community, but we are looking at the possibilities of doing a mixed income approach in the final phase, similar to the approach that we're using at Bunker Hill and Mary Ellen McCormick and at the Bromley Heath development in Jamaica Plain.
Okay. And in terms of how the 35 million is split, I'm sorry, you may have said this already, Director, but you said $10 million for Orient Heights
Correct.
and then 25 for
Correct.
Annam Lynch? Okay.
Yes, Counsel.
Has the state's participation in this phase been different than their sort of ratio of participation in the last phase at all?
No. No. I forget what they contributed in the first phase, but I think it's fair to say that the State Department of Housing and Community Development in this administration and in the previous administration has shown a deep commitment to finishing what I consider to be perhaps the most distressed state-assisted public housing development in the Commonwealth. We continue to talk with the current administration, and again, before we broke ground on this, we were planning and working with the elected officials from Eastie and DHCD and the broader community for years before we even broke ground. But I would say the state partners have been extremely helpful and cooperative.
Okay. And are there any other, what are the other sources of funding besides city?
There's a Mass Works grant, which is state money at Orient Heights, tax credits.
Okay. And no private developers in either of these cases?
There's no private development, no, we're contracted with it's Beacon Development is doing the Old Colony, and Trinity is the private development company that is doing Orient Heights.
But they don't have equity in
They
terms
do,
of the
no.
project? Okay. All right, great. Thank you very
Okay.
much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for all of your great work. I've worked with all of you in a whole host of, on a whole host of issues, and really appreciate your commitment to the city. I'm delighted to be here at this Ways and Means hearing. I proudly supported the sale of Winthrop Square a year or so ago, largely because of the incredible opportunity that sale will provide, and we are seeing it positively here. So, Billy, to think about 220 additional units at Old Colony, 88 additional units at Orient Heights. This is remarkable, and this is going to help us provide safe, clean, wonderful places for Bostonians. Chief Cook, I don't have to tell you my utter love for the Emerald Necklace, for Franklin Park, for so many of the Common as well, so many of these great resources that we have in a city. The average Bostonian lives how far away from a park or playground?
10 minutes or less.
10 minutes
10-minute
or less.
walk or less.
10-minute walk
And that's
or less.
98%, but we'll be announcing an update to that soon.
Good. And if we get electric scooters, it'd be about a 2-minute walk or less. So
I
we
couldn't
could,
possibly
we
imagine.
could help. Excellent. And thank you, Justin, Drew, for your great work. I know this is less so about sort of some specifics, but if I have it right, this is sort of the regulatory work that we need to do to spend this money to help the city. So this is the creation of 3 new trusts. And how many trusts do we Drew, how many trusts do you currently oversee?
I'd say we have over 200.
Wow. Has there been any talk of consolidating some of those? Or I guess you can. It's probably tied to monies that have been specifically earmarked for a specific cause or person.
Correct. Yeah, you've generally got to go before the courts to actually change the function of a trust.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes trusts do become outdated, and it is important to change the function of it. And we've done that in the past, but we've not necessarily, at least as of late, consolidated anything.
Yeah. Okay. That may be interesting just to help clean it up.
Sure.
And then, so the 3 trusts for Boston Common, Franklin Park, and the Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy Greenway, you said they will be trusts of 3 people, the mayor, the city councilor, and a designee of presumably the Friends of the Common or Friends of the Public Garden, Franklin Park Coalition, and then the Greenway, it just is 1 trustee, which will be you or whomever has your seat down the line, correct?
Collector treasurer, so it would be Emma Handy.
Excuse me, so Emma, I'm sorry, I thought it was you. Okay, so Emma. And then just looking through the language, it says it'll be the city councilor whose district the majority lies in. So just so I have that right, would Boston Common be the councilor for District 8?
Yes.
Councilor Zachem, and Franklin Park would be the councilor for District 7? Councilor, who's currently Councilor Janney. Okay. Great. And yeah, this seems pretty straightforward. I'll be delighted to support it when we have to vote on it, Mr. Chairman. So thank you all.
Thank you. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Ciamo. I'm proud to support the proposals placed forth. I do have a couple observations. I want to start first with BHA Administrator Bill McGonigal. I've had an opportunity to visit all the public housing developments in my district, and actually was in Orient Heights recently as well. But I just wanted to compliment you and your team on outstanding work on administrating, working closely with our tenants, treating them fairly, treating them with respect. So I proudly serve that, proudly support this, not because it's just a great plan to help so many people, but because of the leadership at the BHA. I really know that you care about the residents and you're dedicated to the mission of the BHA. So I think, we're proud to have you in that position. So I just want to say thank you, Administrator.
Thank you, Councilor.
The second issue I had, I just want to mention to Commissioner Cook, the Franklin Park funding, probably one of the most diverse parks we have in the city. You see people golfing, you see people jogging and walking, utilizing the park from the neighboring, the various neighborhoods surrounding the park, and it's a beautiful park. They work hard over there. The Parks Department does a great job. So I just wanted to compliment your team as well on Franklin Park.
Thank you, sir. It's a partnership with the Coalition and the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, and we consider it an honor to be able to take care of it.
On the Boston Common, I also represent the Boston Common and the Public Garden. Both parks look beautiful. The Boston Common, as you mentioned, is the oldest park in the city. It's used by so many people, and it's an honor to represent that area with Councilor Zakim, and it's such an important part of our history. So many famous events happen there, but it's really the birthplace of our liberty here in Boston. A lot of it started right here at the Boston Common. So we're proud of the Friends of the Public Garden as well, and the outstanding work they do. So I'm proud to serve that as well. My final point is on the Greenway, and I think I spend at least 5 or 6 days a week in Chinatown, and I represent most of the Greenway. And at times I do get discouraged about the condition of the Greenway in Chinatown, and it has been a concern of mine. I'm not placing any blame with the Greenway Conservancy, and I have expressed my opinion to them many times. I've been on a walking tour through the whole Greenway, and I want to make sure when I support this that the Greenway in Chinatown looks as nice and beautiful as the Greenway outside of Chinatown as well. Am I able to get that commitment from you?
Well, Councilor, I can't speak for the Greenway, but what I can speak for as the Chief Energy, Environment, and Open Space is that I certainly will make a commitment of working with the Greenway Conservancy to renew that focus and make sure that we're keeping that promise for you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just on the technical part of it, so one person would oversee, could you explain the operation of the funding?
Sure. So as with most of our trust, or with many of the trusts, the one person that oversees it, so as the collector treasurer, what they're actually overseeing is the distribution of the funds. As a part of that process, what they're doing is making sure that the disbursement conforms, not necessarily in this case, but with most of our trusts, the disbursement conforms with some type of board vote that was taken, that it's within the scope of what the trust allows, that it's been signed off on by some agent that's a little bit closer to the project to make sure that the work has in fact been done and the invoice is actually in good order. So we serve largely a clerical function as it relates to that, and then we of course invest the money. Now, with respect to the greenway, what we would be doing is simply making sure that the distribution, we would be calculating how much they're owed and making sure that the distribution happens on a quarterly basis. As far as how the funds are expended once they get to the greenway, they would have to be in accordance with the terms of the trust, which I have got a few points here. It is defined in 3.3 of the trust, which broadly just states, because you want it to be broad in the trust, but broadly states that it is established to provide income for the enhanced funding of the operation, management, maintenance, and improvement of the greenway. That is further detailed in an MOU that I'm not quite sure, I believe it's near final, but would have to be in accordance with the terms of the MOU and the exhibit attached to that. So I wouldn't be able to give specifics on the nuts and bolts of exactly what they're spending it on, but we have the controls in place to make sure that it's being spent in accordance with the terms of the trust.
I understand that, but I would be interested in the nuts and bolts of it because I want to make sure that funding does reach
Certainly.
the Chinatown section of the Greenway. So that's important to me. And as I mentioned, I've mentioned that to the Greenway many times. I know Jesse's here as well. But the residents of Chinatown have expressed that to me almost every single time I go in there. So I want to make sure that we can work together to make sure that the Greenway in Chinatown receives equal funding as well as other parts of the Greenway. And I know once you get the money, you send it to the Greenway, but you would not have any influence at all, or recommendations, I should say, where it would go, right?
Right, because we serve a clerical function, we're not really in a position, at least in this case, to be able to determine how it's spent. That would probably be a question better asked to the Greenway.
And I can say the Greenway does look beautiful, and I'm not criticizing the Greenway. But again, I need to make sure, and I need to work hard to make sure that funding for the Greenway reaches Chinatown as well. So that's a concern of mine. I'm not just going to agree, to be a rubber stamp for something if something is not going into the district. So I want to make sure that we can work together so funds can go to this Chinatown section of the Greenway.
If I had a little bit of time, I might be able to get a little bit more clarity on that. I'd certainly like to for you if I can. I don't have it in front of me at the moment.
Thank you.
Stepping back from the trust, Counselor, you certainly have my commitment. There's a lot of different spaces along the Greenway where the Parks Department and also the Rose Kennedy Greenway work hand in hand and have to, frankly, because of the adjacent properties. The Chinatown property with its adjacency to Public Works, and I know Chief Smith is interested in this as well, so we can certainly look towards a collaborative solution for making sure that that space is taken care of properly.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah.
Thank you. Council Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll talk about the trusts a little bit first. So you $5 million in an account. We, get to draw $250 a year off that. Chris, what will you get with your $250?
Well, to be honest with you, Counselor, it's going to be a collaborative process in our two instances. So we'll be meeting with the Friends of the Public Garden and also the District Councilor. The most important aspect of it, though, is that it can't supplant, it can't replicate what we already do in these parks. So I think that's really important that this is, enhanced opportunity for investment in that. So I'll give you an example. At Franklin Park, one of the easiest things is there's a level of tree care required at Franklin Park that is almost unparalleled within the rest of our district. It's really comparable to work that the Department of Conservation and Recreation might do in one of their state facilities, their state parks, where you have large contracts. Something as simple as that, that could take up a large portion of this on an annual basis.
So that was part of my question. Can we spend that on making our trees healthy in all those parks? Because that will eat that whole budget up, I would assume.
Well, it wouldn't need all of it, but we'd have to come up with a plan for it. And I have to give a lot of credit to the Emerald Necklace Conservancy here. They came up with a tree inventory and a tree care plan roughly 4 or 5 years ago, and they've been partnering throughout the necklace with us on that project. We do have, unlike the rest of the city, we have an urban forestry plan for Franklin Park, and so we can implement that in a rolling phase. What we wouldn't want to do is we wouldn't want to use it all up on one activity, but just just that activity alone would make a significant difference in the park, taking
Yeah.
care of the weed trees and making sure that we're protecting those valuable mature trees.
Are there opportunities to augment these funds so we could get more than $250 a year?
Well, from the trust, that if it were coming from the trust, that would require additional deposits into the trust.
That's what I'm asking. How do we, like, can you make additional deposits to that? So if the trusts are now 10 million each, I don't know where that would come from, but you have $1 million
Sure.
to put into both of those locations.
You certainly could. Trusts, once they've been incepted, you're able to make additional deposits, and then the only requirement is that, we will again spend off the income, but to the extent your principal balance is greater, then you would simply have more.
And can you ever, if Chris had identified like an emergency maintenance that needed $1 million, would you be able to draw off that trust?
Well, you're not able to draw off the principal of the trust, and it would be fairly unlikely that there would be $1 million on the income side of the balance sheet. So you would be able to draw the remainder of the income, but you would not be able to, for these particular trusts.
Always needs to stay at 5 million.
Well, that's what we target. So our goal is to make sure that $5 million is held in perpetuity, and in some years it's going to be higher, and in some years it's going to be lower, but we're always targeting for it to be held there at $5 million. And so that's the plan. But we understand that there will be fluctuations with the market from year to year.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you said the emerald necklace. Did you say that?
Yes, sir.
You did. How exciting is this? We're actually talking, like, can you run me through?
Sure.
Because it's something that I'm 50, talking about it, hearing about it my whole life. Yeah, it was supposed to go all through here, down to Columbia Road, down to the beach. Is that really going to happen?
Yeah, so the idea is over 100 years old, and the reason it's still around is it's still a really great idea. And so the Olmsted...
So are we going to stick to the Olmsted plan? Like, how much of this is going to be Olmsted?
With all respect to Olmsted, and Olmsted was a genius at the time, I think our version of completing the Emerald Necklace has to be relevant to our communities now. And so there's an equity component to this. There's certainly a major transportation. Transportation has changed since 1897, so the way this road looks is going to change. However, the idea is still inherently that folks living in and around Franklin Park will be able to get down to what we now call Moakley Park and participate in a harbor waterfront community, and vice versa. The recreational facility of Franklin Park and its adjacency to Harambee Park, Franklin Field, where we'll be celebrating the DJ Simmons Playground dedication later today, would be accessible to folks in South Boston and downtown. And so using Columbia Road as a green linchpin, sort of a mental hitching post for environmental justice between those communities, I think it's an extraordinary once-in-a-generational opportunity. It's going to take a lot of planning. And so the Public Works Department's going to be releasing an RFP soon. It's going to be focused on community process. Because again, what that looks like today is probably something that doesn't look a lot like the Jamaica Way or the Riverway, but includes green infrastructure, includes trees, but makes it a walkable, livable street, but also one that people can actually get from one neighborhood to another.
And what's the focus on resiliency running down Columbia?
Well, it has to be very important. I mean, I think everyone's noticing with the larger storms that we have rolling through, a lot of focus is on Day Boulevard because of the coastal flooding, but what we're seeing on Columbia Road is just the stormwater flooding that happens on Columbia Road. So actually lanes, and sometimes in some instances, entire sides of Columbia Road is being closed in major storms. So there's a really strong call and impact for storm infrastructure, green infrastructure to be built on Columbia Road. And it's also really important when you look at how important that is to our transportation infrastructure. The idea that if Columbia Road goes down, whether it's the commuter rail or bus rapid transit or the fact that people just need to walk it and bike it, if it's inaccessible, there's a real danger there.
Thank you. Do I still have a minute, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Billy, how are you?
Good, Council.
Good. So Old Colony was always just a one-for-one. There was never any private money in there like the way that it's happening now, huh?
No, we
There
began.
were 840 units, or what we built, we got more, the plan will be more than what was the original footprint?
No, roughly the same.
The same?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, thank you, sorry.
What might be different in the final phases, the first two phases I indicated were done with significant federal grants. First phase was actually an ARA grant, stimulus grant, which was a one-shot grant, and then we were lucky enough to get a Hope 6 grant for the final phase two. Neither of those are options at this point.
What was the total of those two grants, Billy?
About 45 million between both of them,
And we got half of it done, like 450.
about half of it done.
Yeah, and then this will get the next,
Next, whoops.
it's not me.
Yes, it is.
It'll do the next quadrant, roughly then about another 25%.
So Fed money's gone, state money isn't readily available. We'll have to do something privately probably on that fourth piece.
Yes, that's my take. And I've had some conversations, kind of general conversations about that, but obviously,
Yeah.
before that plan gets finalized, it'll require a lot more vetting.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We've been
And I will
joined.
be in favor.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Councilor Baker. We've been joined by City Councilor at Large Michael Flaherty. Chair recognizes Councilor Zachem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, gentlemen. Thank you, Chief Cook. Good to see you. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about this the last couple of years, and I see Liz Vizza also from the Friends of the Public Garden up there. And, you know, her organization and our neighbors, I think, really did a great job of hammering out some things that are going to, as we've talked about, really help the affordable housing in the city of Boston, which is a vital need, while also preserving and enhancing our parks for the future, which really is one of the jewels of the city. And I think I'm really proud that we got to this place. And I don't have too many questions because we've spent a lot of time working on this over the years. But just, you know, to you, Commissioner, Chiefs, I'm always got a lot of titles now, Chris. It's tough.
Just Chris is great.
You know, from you and maybe from the folks in the CFO's office, just to address, I mean, this is pretty much identical to what we've always been talking about. There are no changes here to what we've talked about. The trusts are perpetual and binding, and this is how we're going to operate.
Yeah, we're very excited about it because what we believe is it actually creates an opportunity to take care of these parks forever. I will say that one thing, and you mentioned the Friends of the Public Garden, so I have to give them a lot of credit for this point, that the idea that this would be enhanced, and so that the city and also, frankly, the Friends of the Public Garden can't walk away from their mutual obligations of what takes care in the park now. So as we get through the RFP process for the master plan, which we're going through right now, we released the RFP a couple of weeks ago, and we developed the master plan for Boston Common. Both the city and the Friends of the Public Garden will be engaged in this work through a memorandum of understanding. And then these trusts will help take care of the enhanced design that is the result of that master plan. So it's an extraordinary opportunity.
Yeah, I would just add that it's a really elegant solution to sort of providing a new source of income for these sort of very valuable parks, at the same time protecting what is a city asset that we sold at one point that is going to maintain in perpetuity forever. So those $5 million trusts are going to exist, you know, and that's never at risk in this plan.
I'd also like to just make a point of clarification. So these no trusts are, you know, ever look exactly the same because they all have their own special attributes. These are familiar enough that they're going to look like most of what you've already seen. I would say that the Greenways Trust is a bit different because it does contemplate that this would be in place for a period of 10 years.
No.
And per the trust at the...
So the Greenways will be paid down.
Nope. So at the end of 10 years, that $5 million is still there, but it comes back to the city.
Oh, that's great.
But it's just not, so it's invested like it's held in perpetuity, but it's not actually held in perpetuity.
But back it would go to the general fund under the terms of the trust, or?
Well, the trust didn't get that specific, but I would assume it flows back to the city, so that would be the general fund, and then you determine what to do.
And Chris, for the funds that the city will be, you know, the Franklin Park and the Public Garden Common Fund, that's going to go, you said, to make sure we're not replicating what's currently being done. So are we talking about for capital? Are we talking about for ongoing?
Well, I think maintenance and operations in the case of Franklin Park, they're for the vitality and the history of the Franklin Park Coalition, there may be programming aspects of it, but the most important thing is that the trustees themselves are actually determining that budget on an annual basis. I think the most important thing that was an important cornerstone of the Friends of the Public Gardens agreement, and for us, an equity component to also extend it to Franklin Park Coalition, is that it can't replace existing activities.
Right, and then the larger numbers are for capital.
That's right,
in both
sir.
those parks, and that's dedicated and based, at least for the common and public garden, that's based on what the master planning process is going to be. So is that money set? Where is that going to sit? Because ostensibly this will take, I would say,
Sure.
easily 2 years. I mean, you know, these things can go on before we have a master plan that we're moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. In last year's budget, with the help of the council, we appropriated $800,000 for Franklin and $500 for the common to start those master planning efforts. What we're proposing to do today would be to take that money out of surplus property and put it into what we call our capital fund, so that in next year's budget, we're going to really come to the table with a cash flow and a plan of what years that's going to come to the table. So you will see this in future capital plans as it's laid out, but this is the process by which we take it out of the surplus property and put it into the city's capital fund.
And this is as much as possible at this point spoken for, as in there's not a scenario for changing where these funds go, because, I mean, before we actually spend it, it's going to be a little, I mean, there's planning, there's RFPs, there's community process, but this is there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I would say the only thing I would add to that is that it's not limited to these amounts. So there may be projects where we try to augment it through philanthropic means, or, you know, Article 80 process if there's another building down the road. But this is what we're going to be spending to implement it, but that doesn't mean that we might want to spend more if funds become available.
But the bulk, the 20, the numbers right in front, the 25 plus million or whatever it is for each one, those are set, they're there, and they are just awaiting an actual plan to be implemented.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, and I want to thank the chairman for this and for everyone who worked on this multi-years process, from the developer at Millennium to the different neighborhood groups to our colleagues. It was not always fun, but I'm really proud that we are here and that we're taking big steps forward for the parks and for public housing and low-income families in the city.
Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you. Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris, if I can just take you back to Day Boulevard and Columbia Road, the big knuckle there is Kosciuszko Circle. Is that planned for any of this here? Because in order to get from there to there, you have to cut through Kosciuszko, which is a disaster.
Yeah, it's difficult, and so what I wouldn't want to do is I wouldn't want to comment on something that the Public Works Department is far more intimately and, you know, better versed at. What I will say, though, is that the planning has to be holistic, and so I think there's numerous opportunities for joint planning, not only with the state portion of Columbia Road, the city portion of Columbia Road, obviously the MBCR, and then, of course, the Kosciuszko Circle. That relates to the end vision of Moakley Park. When we look at redeveloping that property, how people are going to access that recreational opportunity, the city has to be engaged in that. And so the other element that's in the mix there that there has to be joint planning on is the redevelopment of the Bayside site.
Fair, and then you and I have obviously walked that site, and we clearly distinguish sort of what the city owns and what the state owns. So is it fair to say that the state, specifically DCI, are they a partner in these discussions? That's going to be vital.
They have to be, Councilor, or else we'll really be at odds. And so the real opportunity here is that with a portion of these proceeds being able to be freed up for joint planning, that will remove some of the stumbling blocks. When you get down to the brass tacks of the operations of these spaces, it really just becomes there's very few maintenance dollars to go around. And so capital assets start to deteriorate over time, and then that develops into, you know, finger point of you own this, you own that. If we can just step back and actually plan this together, but then we can worry about, well, what's a cohesive plan for maintenance? It's not fair that the public has to live with deteriorating sidewalks just because the city parks department, the state parks department can't agree on whose sidewalk it is.
Right. And I think in parts of you go around Moakley, Billy probably knows it as well as I do, the sidewalk is a pretty significant size sidewalk. Half of the sidewalk is owned by the state and the other half is owned. And so having a coordinated effort there, I mean, can you imagine like going out and digging up half of the sidewalk and then we pour fresh cement and then we'll wait for the state to do their part. So, and there's the fencing, parts of the fence belong to the city, parts of the fence belong to the state. If we're dealing with two different contractors, we're gonna have two different color and two different types of fences. So that's vital in terms of that partnership, if you will, is gonna be important for the revitalization down at Moakley. So, and obviously Kosciuszko is a big part of that. In order to get there, you have to cut through there, and along with, as Council Baker had referred to on the climate ready stuff. But that's going to be a big piece. And then probably a case of first impression, being the longest-serving council to have something this significant come along at the $105 million. So without getting in the weeds and the funds and the trust and the trustees, that's probably not necessarily our role in terms of dealing with peeling back the onion, but to see the great dividends that's going to be provided to our parks, and then to Bill, if you can just touch base in terms of what is this going to mean for folks over at Orient Heights and folks at the Oak Colony that you know so well, in terms of being able to restore a level of funding that you desperately need to provide good quality, safe housing for folks in our city.
Yeah, it will enable us to continue the momentum of the complete revitalization of both of those sites. Councilor, the $25 million for this will get us another quadrant at Old Colony. We'll demo the remaining deteriorating buildings on Dorchester Street and head down East State Street all the way to Mercer. That entire quadrant will be leveled and rebuilt, similar to the beautiful buildings that we did in Phase 1 and Phase 2. Likewise, at Orient Heights, we did a ribbon cutting out there a few months ago for the 120 brand-new units, and everybody, the reviews were fantastic. The housing there is absolutely fantastic. The neighborhood loves it. Our residents love it, and we're looking forward to continuing that momentum with this grant to get Phase 2 done and working with the state to finish it up in Phase 3.
We talked to a lot of the residents over there. The start of the Columbus Day Parade this year was at the base of Orient Heights, and so a lot of the residents were down there.
Yep.
They alternate between East Boston and the North End. They take turns every other year. But there were a lot of folks at the very start of it, which was at the base of Orient Heights, right at the mouth of start of Suffolk Downs.
Yep.
And there was a lot of them out there talking about the big improvements that have been made out there. So that's, I think, why this body supported that whole process. So
Yep.
good. I appreciate your time and attention to both of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. I just have a couple of questions on, are they marketing the condos yet? Do you know?
I don't know. From my understanding, and we can certainly get some answers from our folks at our friends at the BPDA, but it's a longer process because they're going to obviously have to go through construction in the next year or two. Right. And then as those come online, the city starts to unlock some of that additional funding.
Right. So it isn't like on completion of the entire sale of the building?
It's as they're sold. It's on a square footage basis.
Great. When will these funds that we're setting up the trust for be ready to be distributed? Do we have to wait a year for the interest to accrue to start this program?
We would, I know at least because we've fleshed it out, I know at least with the Greenway Conservancy, there would be an amount prorated for 8 months. Made more quickly available. Right. With the others, I think we would just go ahead and take, I would have to go back and look. We should be able to just go ahead and take the $5 million and assume that
reimburse ourselves,
right.
so to speak? Okay. Right. So we're going to make these funds available by, let's say, the new year, around that time?
Well, normally what we would do, so normally what we would do is we would actually wait and run the calculation on February 1 with a look back as of December 31st, and we would know exactly how much was in principal, run the 5% calculation, and not make that money available until the beginning of the fiscal year.
July 1 of 19. Great.
Right.
And Bill, you probably, as the second longest serving counselor, the BHA used to get a portion of the proceeds from Winthrop Square until it closed. Is that correct? Just for background for people who might not know that.
Under the Menino administration, we had an arrangement where the proceeds from the parking garage were paid to us on a quarterly basis to provide funding for our public safety efforts, our policing efforts.
Right, right. And now, I mean, I won't get into the weeds, but they switched over to municipal.
No. At one point in the long history of the Public Safety Department of the BHA, there were municipal police officers partnered with BHA police officers. That was discontinued quite some time ago. Right. At the moment, it's a relatively small force of BHA police officers.
Right. Do you remember how much revenue you used to generate through the garage?
It was a couple of $1 million a year. It was $2.5 million a year, I
And it
think.
closed
yeah.
in 2015? Did we close it in 20?
Geez, I think it was sooner than that, wasn't it? Earlier than that, I mean.
Early 2013, maybe? But
It was either FY17 or FY16 that we made a similar investment in the BHA Public Safety Office of about $4 million, but that was several years ago. I think that was right
That
around
was
this.
separate, yeah.
Right,
From the
right.
garage, yeah.
So it might have been, to your point, before Mayor Walsh.
Yeah, it seems
I think
it
it
was
was
quite
close,
something,
yeah.
several years ago.
Great. Counselor Flynn, you had a follow-up? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Council Siomo. I just had one final question for Commissioner Cook. How will this funding impact those in our disability community? Will it enhance their access to any of the parks?
That's a good question. We hadn't thought about that explicitly, but I would say issues of equity sort of infuse all of our investments now. So when we look at our Parks First initiative, it's about access, equity, and excellence. And equity is about making sure that we're providing these opportunities to the most diverse population as possible. So when you look at enhanced maintenance, that really comes down to ideas of pathway maintenance, and when we look at even things such as simple as tree pruning and tree work, making sure that you're keeping pathways clear, as well as pruning around the existing lighting structures in parks. When parks agencies don't have those funds readily available, it's typically the disability community that's disproportionately affected when those facilities start to crack, right? Mm-hmm. So when our pathways start to crumble, or when there isn't appropriate tree pruning and it's blocking pathways, or perhaps a ramp system isn't being properly maintained, it's actually, disproportionate that community that pays that price, and that there's a huge inequity associated with that. So anytime that we have the ability to enhance the maintenance of these facilities, I think we're we're making gains in access. But I would say that you have to make sure that as we approach these investments, that we're really putting that at the forefront of our thought. So it's a good reminder.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll be glad to support this. I think it's a great plan, moving Boston forward on public housing, our parks, recreation, our open space, our green space. So I think the city administration came up with a good plan here, so be glad to support it.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Anybody else from my colleagues? No? Great. I have several letters as public testimony that I will enter into the record and distribute to my colleagues from the Franklin Park Coalition, the Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy, the Friends of the Public Garden Common Committee, and finally, the the folks from BHA. Yep. Thank you. And now at this point, I have several people who wish to testify, and through the graciousness of a few people, I'm calling Jesse Brackenberry first, and then Liz Visa, Sam Tyler. And then last, Jana? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Siamo, and all of the city councilors who are here today. The Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy appreciates the invitation to supply testimony to the Boston City Council. I'm Jesse Brackenbury. I'm the executive director of the Greenway Conservancy. As you mentioned, we've supplied written testimony, which I will not read aloud, but wanted to summarize our testimony. We'd like to speak to the committee today specifically about the impact that the funding will have on the Greenway as part of a shared solution for the sustainable funding of the public park, entered into by the state and the city and the abutting property owners. The Greenway is the contemporary public park in the heart of Boston. Our nonprofit, the Greenway Conservancy, was established through state legislation in 2008 to maintain, program, finance, and improve the 1.5-mile Greenway on behalf of the public. The majority of the public park's operating budget has been and is currently provided by private sources. Over the past 10 years, the Greenway has blossomed into one of the Commonwealth's most active and popular public spaces, where people gather, play, unwind, and explore. The Greenway hosts 400 free events annually, is home to an award-winning contemporary public art program, maintains the 7 water features and fountains, and organically cares for the lawns and gardens. Despite the Conservancy's success in developing the Greenway into a world-class public park, another theme of the park's existence has been an uncertain funding situation. The original funding model, 50% public funds and 50% private funds, proved challenging for the fiscally constrained public sector. So since inception, private funds have instead represented about 60% of the funding to the public park. The Conservancy has brought more than $40 million to the public park, growing programming, art, and other offerings. So in 2017, this situation was resolved when the city, the Commonwealth, the Greenway Conservancy, and abutting property owners agreed to a shared solution for foundational funding that charted a new, sustainable course for the Greenway. Commercial property owners stepped up to join private sector philanthropists in playing a huge role in funding the public park. The Greenway Business Improvement District, supported here and approved here this spring, this fall has made its first payment to support the maintenance and enhancement of the park. And philanthropy continues to support improvements like this summer's opening of the Carolyn Lynch Garden on the Greenway. We'd not be in this place without the significant bipartisan political leadership offered by Mayor Walsh, the City Council, Governor Baker, Senator Boncore, Representative Michaelwitz, and others who understood the particular challenge of ensuring the Greenway's continued place as a treasured civic amenity. This allocation of funding from the City of Boston is the final piece in the multi-party funding deal, and the city's participation was a key element in bringing all the parties together for the final deal for the public park. We're excited that the Greenway and other parks will be recipients of funding subsequent to adoption of this bill, and we urge the committee to recommend passage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Fielma and City Councilors. Thank you so much for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the appropriations before you. My name is Liz Visa. I'm Executive Director of the Friends of the Public Garden. The Friends of the Public Garden has worked for 48 years in partnership with the city's Parks Department to care for, enhance, and protect the Boston Common, the Public Garden, and Commonwealth Avenue Mall. We have over a $2 million annual budget. We because we have that kind of support, we support the city in expanding its capacity. The city has done more over the years, but it needs to do more, and this will be an important part of that ability to do more, this appropriation. So as Councilor Zakem suggested, there was a long and struggle getting here. But we are here, and we're pleased to see the funds from the sale of the Winthrop Square Garage come before you and to be appropriated to the important support of the Boston Common, as well as Franklin Park, Emerald Necklace, and public housing. So I urge you to support the appropriation as requested, particularly the $28 million to come to the Boston Common, $23 million for capital improvements, $5 million for a trust. It is an important investment in our most heavily used park, and one that needs extra care given the impact of shadows from a developing downtown. $5 million for maintenance is really critical as well. We know that we love to do capital improvements to parks, but that needs to be cared for in perpetuity after that work is done. So $23 million could disappear in this park very easily. There's much that needs to be done in this 48 acres, which is the neighborhood park for almost 40,000 people. And millions of people come to see this park and enjoy it for protest, celebration, neighborhood picnics, permanent events. Hundreds of permanent events occur here. So it's a very heavily used park, and it needs this kind of investment. We are pleased that the Parks Department has issued an RFP. It went out last month. Proposals are due October 25th, and we look forward to having a team hired and begin this good work, an important work, with a robust public process of saying, where does $23 million need to be invested in this park? What are the needs? We have ideas, the Parks Department has ideas, but it's very important to listen to the public for their ideas. This park is in good condition, but it needs to be brought up to the highest levels of excellence as our center stage of civic life. Just as CPA funding should not do so, I think the chief indicated this earlier, but it's critical that this funding not supplant budget funding for the Parks Department. Our parks need so much more than they get, and with all due respect, we cannot continue to expect the Parks Department to do more with less. We have to do more with more. Operations funding is critical, and what we see now is $23 million coming to this park. That will mean more capital projects, so we need more management staff to support that. CPA is going to mean more capital projects. There are only so many bodies that can do those projects, so we need support in the staffing of the Parks Department on operations as well as on management in order to keep up with this challenge of doing the good work that needs to be done in this park. We hope that we will be very proud and excited about the outcome of the master plan and the work that can be done as a result of this money. So I urge you to support this appropriation and look forward to getting that work done with you. Thank you.
Thanks. Sam? Sam Tyler, President of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau.
Mr. Chairman, members, for the record, my name is Sam Tyler, President of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. I'm here to speak on Docket 1441, the mayor's proposal for allocating $105.4 million from the proceeds of the sale of the city-owned Winthrop Square garage parcel. The Research Bureau supports the application of these one-time proceeds for capital purposes. However, we do have concerns about those proceeds that would be placed in an endowment trust with the interest used for maintenance purposes, which is an operational expense. And we also question the legal authority of the City of Boston to create a trust in which city revenues are allocated to serve a municipal purpose. As has been discussed, the $105 million is currently in the city's Surplus Property Disposition Fund, which is the depository of revenues generated from the city's sale of the city-owned land and other capital assets, such as Winthrop Square Garage. The fund was originally established in 1982 and revised, modified in 1986. The Bureau was part of that 1986 change, which really required the City Council to approve the funds to be used for purposes other than capital. And that's I guess, a concern. For several years, the city used the Surplus Property Disposition Fund for $5 million to support the city's Leading the Way program, which is a housing program, which we supported because the city doesn't have legal authority under state law to borrow for housing, and so it made sense. So the bottom line is the proceeds from the sale of capital assets for us, I mean, the basic municipal principle is that proceeds from the sale of a city-owned capital asset should be used for capital purposes. And that's the reason we have the concern about the mechanism that would end up using the proceeds from those funds for operational expenses. If it weren't for the Boston Special Act dealing with the proceeds, the city of Boston would be treated like every other city and town in Massachusetts and would be only able to use the proceeds from the sale of other disposal real estate for capital purposes. That's what Mass General Laws Section 63 says. And again, if Boston were treated like every other city and town, the question here would only be using the funds for capital purposes. We did support the use of proceeds for the housing program since the city has no authority to borrow for that purpose. However, we did oppose the $4 million of proceeds to support the funding for public safety in the Boston Housing Authority in 2016, since clearly those were operational expenses. However, at that time, we did suggest a more appropriate revenue source for that same purpose. So of the endowment proceeds of the $105.4 million, approximately, I think, $90.4 million or 86% will be used for capital purposes. And as I said, we do support that. The remaining $15 million or 14% we've already heard would be placed in three endowment funds. And while the endowment proceeds would remain intact as city revenue and only the interest applied to maintenance expenses, the mechanism, in our view, is inconsistent with the financial principle of applying the proceeds from the sale of a capital asset for capital purposes, which again is why we express our concern. The city's fiscal 19 budget of $3.29 billion is supported by conservative revenue estimates, and we believe the city can achieve its objectives on the maintenance front in other ways. The city is already challenged in how it will support the capital expenses outlined in the various planning initiatives that have been approved under the umbrella of Boston 2030, and $15 million to support those capital expense as these dollars should be used would be helpful and appropriate. On the issue of the Maintenance Trust Fund, the question, we have, just from our discussion with legal experts in municipal finance, we have questions as to whether the City of Boston has that authority to create the trust and to use its own municipal revenue for those purposes. And so I would recommend to the City Council that before it acts and approves this proposal, that it request a letter from the Corporation Council explaining the legal justification for these trusts. And I would also suggest that the City Council refer this question to the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. I think you want to be sure that what is being proposed can be executed before the council actually acts on this. And so that's basically our testimony on this issue.
Thank you, Sam. Jana? Is Jana still here? Oh. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jana Cohen-Rosenthal. I'm the Executive Director of the Franklin Park Coalition. I recently started about 2 months ago at the Coalition, and I've been a long-time neighbor of Franklin Park and a resident of Rosendale. So the Franklin Park Coalition is the voice for Franklin Park and the people who live in the surrounding neighborhoods. And on behalf of the Board of Directors, our members, I'm speaking today in support of the appropriation of $105 million from the Surplus Property Disposition Fund to provide funding for housing and for city signature open spaces, including Franklin Park. So we are generally excited about the mayor's vision for Franklin Park, including the focus on the park in the Imagine Boston 2030 plan. As partners in good faith of the city, we have aided in reviewing the Franklin Park Master Planning RFP and the creation of a trust fund. And as you may be aware, the Franklin Park Coalition came together in the 1970s to support the art program of Elma Lewis and to help bring the park back from prolonged neglect. The park is better used and more vibrant today. However, it has a long way to go to fulfill its promise as the city's largest and most central green space and the crown jewel of the Emerald Necklace. The Parks and Recreation Department's efforts to create a new master plan and infuse Franklin Park with $28 million from the Winthrop Square project has the potential to be game-changing for our community. It's also another generational opportunities occurring as the Commonwealth recently announced their plan to relocate the Shattuck Hospital to the south end from the 13 acres property that was previously part of Franklin Park. They are creating a new campus plan. We support innovative cross-sector approaches that address modern public health concerns through truly equitable access to open space and recreation. Wealth and health disparities and racial bias toward people of color are and will remain a significant factor in our communities despite this funding. This exacerbates the differences in investments both in the park and our surrounding communities. We acknowledge that there's less access to community wealth for additional conservation and programming efforts in Franklin Park than our friends representing downtown parks. We are supportive of the Franklin Park Trust Fund as it incorporates the need for both improved facilities and vibrant programming of those spaces. We will continue to seek out additional partnerships and private sector champions that will help address these disparities. We will also remain strong advocates for creating a master plan that balances growth with preventing resident displacement when improvements to the park make the area more valuable. Frederick Law Olmsted, the park's designer, wrote that government's duty was to protect individual citizens' pursuit of happiness. His goal for Franklin Park was to provide access to nature and recreation so that it would be a monopoly not be a monopoly in a very peculiar manner of a very, very few, very rich people. And that the great mass of society, including those to whom it would be the greatest benefit, is excluded from it. So in this spirit, we look forward to continuing to work with you in furthering the revival and restoration of our city's signature open spaces, including Franklin Park. I invite all the members of this committee and everyone present here today to come take a walk in the park or run in our upcoming Thanksgiving Day Turkey Trot 5K with myself, with board members, and community representatives to discuss our shared vision for utilizing this funding. Thank you all again for your leadership and dedication to our city's parks and to housing, and for helping to bring about this immense opportunity for Franklin Park and the surrounding community. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes everyone who signed up to testify publicly. If there is nobody else, I see none. This hearing regarding docket 1441 is hereby adjourned.